There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to the American West. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, but the silence of something watching. It settles over the red earth like a second skin, fills the spaces between juniper and sage, pools in the dry creek beds where water has not run for a generation. The men who came west looking for gold, for land, for the clean slate that only distance can promise, they did not understand this silence. They brought their noise with them, their hammers and their gospels and their rifles, and for a while, the noise seemed to work. For a while, it seemed the land would simply absorb them, the way sand absorbs blood, quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. But the silence was only waiting. The silence, it turns out, is extraordinarily patient. This is not a story about heroes. It is not a story about manifest destiny or the romance of the open frontier. The textbooks will give you that version, the clean-jawed men on horseback, the sunset behind them painted amber and gold, the sense that all that space was simply waiting to be claimed. But the men who actually crossed those territories in the years following the Civil War carried something with them that no textbook chose to record. They carried damage in the way that a cracked vessel carries water, badly, and with great loss along the way. They came west broken, most of them, and the West, rather than healing them, had a way of finding the precise fault line of each man's fracture and pressing down upon it, slowly, with the steady, indifferent weight of the geological. Consider the town of Harrow's Gulch, which no longer exists and never properly existed to begin with. You will not find it on any map drawn by official hands. The census takers who passed through that region in the spring of 1874 recorded a population of 83 souls, then crossed the settlement out entirely on their return journey 6 months later, offering no explanation in their ledgers, simply a single horizontal line drawn through the name, as though erasure were sufficient and no further accounting was required. What happened in Harrow's Gulch in those intervening months is not a story that anyone told willingly afterward. The few who left, and there were very few, did not speak of it in any coherent way. They spoke around it, the way a tongue works around a broken tooth, aware of the shape of the wound without ever quite touching the wound directly. A man named Elias Cutter arrived in Harrow's Gulch in early February of that year. He was 31 years old, which in 1874 in the territories counted as middle age. He had ridden hard from Missouri, from a farm that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. A farm he had lost in ways that the record does not entirely specify, but that seem to have involved fire and debt, and the particular catastrophe of a man who trusted the wrong men at the wrong time. Elias was not a remarkable man in any outward sense. He was tall, spare, with the economical movements of someone who had learned long ago that the body is not an infinite resource. His face was weathered to something beyond merely brown. It had taken on the color and texture of the landscape itself, as though the sun had been slowly, methodically erasing the softer version of him that had once existed. What distinguished Elias from the other men who drifted into Harrow's Gulch that winter was something that the townspeople would later struggle to name. The barkeeper, a Swede named Ingmar Voss, would say years afterward that Elias had eyes that listened more than they looked. He meant by this something specific, though he lacked the vocabulary to be fully precise about it. He meant that when Elias looked at a room, it did not feel like he was seeing the room. It felt like he was hearing something within the room that no one else could detect. A frequency, a signal, something that kept arriving and arriving from some direction no one else could determine. Elias had been in the war. Nearly every man in Harrow's Gulch had been in the war, on one side or the other, and this fact lay over the town like the shadow of a cliff that nobody mentioned, because everybody understood that to mention the shadow would require also mentioning the cliff, and the cliff was enormous, and no one wished to look directly at it. But Elias had been in the war in a particular way. He had been at a place called Westing Creek, which was a skirmish, not even a proper battle, not the kind of engagement that warranted a name in the histories. 40 men went in, and 11 came out. What happened to the other 29 is described in no document that has survived, though documents were written. They were written by the 11 survivors, and then, evidently, destroyed by those same survivors within days of being composed. What we have is the shape of the absence of those documents. What we have is the silence that surrounds the fact of Westing Creek like a moat. What Elias brought with him to Harrow's Gulch, though he could not have named it, and the year 1874 had no name for it, was a mind that had been altered at the structural level. Not broken, precisely, not mad in the theatrical sense that the period understood madness, something more precise and more terrible than madness. His mind had been reorganized around a central experience of horror, the way a river is reorganized around a new obstacle. The water still flows, the water still reaches the sea, but the path it takes is entirely different from the path it once took, and certain channels that once ran full are now dry, and certain new channels have formed that run very fast and very deep, and carry you somewhere you did not mean to go. The town of Harrow's Gulch had its own reorganization underway, though its citizens did not know this yet. It had been founded on silver, a vein of it discovered in 1869 by a prospector named Chalk Davis, who had the good fortune to find the silver and the catastrophic misfortune to tell other people about it before he had properly secured his claim. Within 2 years, Chalk Davis was dead of something the coroner listed as fever, but that bore, in the description of his final days, an uncanny resemblance to grief. The silver was real, but difficult, embedded in the rock in ways that required more machinery and more capital than the original settlers had anticipated. And by 1874, the mine was operating at a loss that everyone agreed was temporary, and everyone suspected was permanent. There was, in the earth beneath Harrow's Gulch, another thing besides silver. The Comanche had known about this place and had avoided it for reasons they explained to no settler who asked, because no settler asked with sufficient humility to receive an answer. The Jicarilla Apache, who passed through the region in their seasonal movements, altered their route by 30 miles to avoid the particular valley where the town sat, a deviation so costly in terms of water and exposure that it speaks to a depth of conviction that purely rational explanation cannot account for. What they knew, or what they felt, or what they perceived about that valley was expressed in their languages through a word that translates approximately as the place where the self comes undone, though this translation is contested, and the more literal rendering offered by a different scholar suggests something closer to the place where you find out what you are. Elias found work at the mine. It suited him, the underground labor, the way the shaft swallowed the sky and replaced it with stone. He was not a man who found the open sky comfortable. Too much of it. Too much space in which things could approach from unexpected directions. Below ground there were walls. There was the absolute certainty of where the walls were, and this felt to Elias like the nearest thing to safety he had encountered since Westing Creek. He worked alongside a man named Tom Beaumont, who was from Tennessee, who was also a veteran, who had also been altered by the war in ways he managed with whiskey, and a deliberate, maintained cheerfulness that sat on his actual personality the way a coat sits on a hook, useful, present, but not really part of the body beneath it. Tom was the one who first heard the sound. He described it to Elias on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of February, sitting outside the mine entrance in the last of the gray afternoon light, picking rock dust from beneath his fingernails with the point of a knife. He said it was a sound like voices, but not quite voices, or maybe it was more accurate to say it was the shape that voices leave after the voices have gone. The echo without the original sound, the impression in the air, the way a room still holds the configuration of a conversation that ended hours ago. He said he had heard it first at the lowest level of the shaft, the level they called the 4th room, which was the newest excavation, blasted out of the rock only in November of the previous year. He said it came from the west wall of the fourth room, which was solid rock, and offered no explanation for what he was hearing. Elias listened to this without expression. Then he said he had heard it too. He had heard it since his second day underground. He had not mentioned it because he had assumed it was something wrong with his own hearing, a consequence, he supposed, of the artillery at Westing Creek, which had left a permanent alteration in how his ears processed certain frequencies. He had assumed the sound was interior. He had assumed it was a symptom. He had not considered the possibility that it was a report. The other miners, when asked, gave answers that varied in ways that were themselves significant. Some had heard nothing. A few, the most recently arrived, heard what they described as a kind of pressure rather than a sound, as though the air in the fourth room was slightly too heavy, slightly too full of some quality they could not name. One man, a German immigrant named Friedrich Bauer, who had been in the mine since the previous summer, said that the sound was not new, that he had been hearing it for months, but that he had understood it to be the sound of the mountain dreaming, and that one did not comment on the dreams of mountains for the same reason one does not interrupt a sleeping man. Because what a mountain dreams, if it were to be woken suddenly and completely, would be too large for a human mind to receive. The foreman of the mine was a man named Aldous Pierce, and Aldous Pierce is the figure around whom the events of Harrow's Gulch began to organize themselves with increasing urgency as the weeks passed. He was a compact, precise man, the kind of man who had replaced all softness in himself with efficiency so completely that he had lost the memory of the softness. He kept a journal, one of the few primary documents that survived from Harrow's Gulch, though several pages have been removed, and the removed pages are notable for the ragged edges they leave behind, the way their absence is itself a kind of testimony. What the remaining pages show is a man undergoing a very specific kind of deterioration, not a descent into chaos, a descent into a terrible, cold, crystalline clarity. His early entries are administrative, tonnage extracted, costs of powder and timber, wages paid and owed. The handwriting is small, controlled, the handwriting of a man for whom control is not a preference, but a philosophy. But beginning around the third week of February, the same week Tom Beaumont first mentioned the sound, the entries begin to change in register without changing in tone. The handwriting remains controlled, the sentences remain clipped and declarative, but the content shifts. He writes, "Surveyed the fourth room again today. The west wall is approximately 14 feet from the silver vein. We will reach it within 2 weeks if conditions hold." Then, without any break, without any transition, he writes, "Something is making the men inefficient. I cannot determine the source of the inefficiency. I suspect it originates with Cutter." He writes this as flatly as he writes about tonnage. He writes it as a material fact. What Aldous Pierce believed about Elias Cutter is difficult to reconstruct in its entirety because the man expressed himself only in the most compressed and functional language, and because several of the pages where his beliefs found their fullest expression are among those that were removed. But from what remains, a picture assembles itself. Pierce had become convinced that Elias was the source of a kind of contamination. Not physical, not moral in the conventional sense, but something more fundamental. A contamination of perception. He wrote, "A man who has seen what Cutter has seen carries it in his eyes like a fever. He does not infect the body. He infects the understanding." It is possible to read this and dismiss it as the paranoia of a man already unraveling. It is also possible to read it as an unusually precise description of something real. Both readings can be simultaneously true. The West was good at that, at producing situations where the crazy explanation and the accurate explanation were identical, where the symptom and the diagnosis pointed in the same direction from opposite ends. By March, the sound in the fourth room had been heard by everyone who entered it. This was no longer a matter of individual sensitivity or prior damage. It was a shared phenomenon, and the fact of its being shared changed its nature, gave it a social existence, an agreement between minds that it was real, which is a very different kind of reality from the reality of one mind alone. The men began to arrive at work in the morning already tired, not with the tiredness of inadequate sleep, though that was present too, but with a deeper tiredness, a tiredness that sleep could not reach, as though the machinery of rest had developed a fault that no quantity of unconsciousness could repair. Their dreams had changed. This emerged gradually, in fragments of conversation, the way men talk around difficult things, sideways, without direct acknowledgement, using humor and deflection as the blunt instruments of approach. What they described, when they described it at all, were not nightmares in the conventional sense, not pursuit, not monsters, not the Gothic theater of anxiety. What they described were dreams of clarity, of suddenly, with great precision, understanding something. And the understanding was the terrible part. Not what they understood, which they could never quite articulate, but the understanding itself, the sensation of knowing something that the waking mind was constitutionally incapable of holding, and the loss of it upon waking, and the way the loss left a shape, an outline, a vacancy in the consciousness that the waking mind kept probing the way a tongue probes the socket of a lost tooth, insistently, compulsively, without satisfaction and without cessation. Elias Cutter was not sleeping at all. He sat in the single room he rented from the widow Margaret Cole, who ran a boarding house on the eastern edge of the settlement, and he sat by the window in the hours that were supposed to be for sleeping, and he looked out at the dark. Margaret Cole would say afterward that she had sometimes come down in the middle of the night for water, and seen the strip of light under his door, and heard nothing from inside. No movement, no sound, not even the sound of breathing. And that this absence of sound from a living man had frightened her in a way she could not logically defend, but could not logically abandon. She said it was like rooming with a man who was practicing being somewhere else. What Elias was doing, in those hours by the window, was listening. The sound from the mine had followed him home. Or perhaps it had always been there, and the mine had simply been the place where he had finally become quiet enough to hear it. It was not, he was increasingly certain, coming from outside him. But neither was it coming from what he understood as inside him. It seemed to occupy a third position, a place that had no architectural equivalent in any geography he had been given language to describe. It was coming from the direction of what he had been, from the side of the self that faced Westing Creek, from the 29 men who had gone into that skirmish and not come out. He had never told anyone what had happened at Westing Creek, not the surgeons who dressed his wounds afterward, not the officers who had debriefed the survivors, not the woman he had briefly married in Missouri, who had eventually left him for reasons she listed as specific, but which amounted to the single fact that she could not reach him, that there was a room inside Elias Cutter that had no door from her side. What happened at Westing Creek was not a secret he kept from others. It was a secret he kept from himself. He had constructed around that central event a structure of not knowing, so elaborate and so well maintained that it had become, for all practical purposes, a second self, a self that walked and worked and spoke and appeared to be present, while the original self sat sealed in that interior room, pressing against the door from the inside. The sound was the door beginning to open. Aldous Pierce made his decision in the second week of March. He decided to break through the west wall of the fourth room. The silver vein was close, days away, he believed, perhaps a week. The delay was costing money that the operation could not afford to lose. What some of the men had been saying about the wall, the things they claimed to hear, the things Friedrich Bauer claimed to feel in the stone when he pressed his palm against it, Pierce recorded in his journal and then wrote beneath the recording, "Superstition bred by idleness. Men need to be working. Work is the cure for whatever this is." He was not wrong about work. Work is a cure for many things, but there are conditions that work cannot cure, because they are not maladies of the idle mind. They are reports, and reports, ignored, do not disappear. They simply find other channels. The blasting began on a Tuesday morning and was completed by Thursday evening. What they broke through into was a space, not a cave, or not simply a cave, a chamber, roughly oval, roughly 15 feet across and 10 feet high, in which the air was wrong in a way that the men felt in their sinuses and their eyes before they felt it anywhere else. The walls of the chamber were covered in something, not markings, or not only markings. What covered the walls was a stratigraphy of time, layer upon layer of something deposited over a span that no man present had the geology to estimate, but which several of them, independently, described as feeling like a very long time. Like a longer time than human beings had been in this part of the world. Perhaps a longer time than human beings had been in the world at all. Friedrich Bauer, who was the first through the breach, stood in the chamber for approximately 40 seconds, and then walked back out through the tunnel without speaking. He went to the surface, collected his coat and his personal tools, walked to the livery stable, saddled his horse, and rode out of Harrow's Gulch, heading north. He did not stop to collect wages owed to him. He did not speak to anyone. He was seen by two people on his way through town, and both of them described his expression the same way. As the expression of a man who has just been given an answer he had not wanted to the question he had been asking all his life. The remaining men entered the chamber in groups of 2 and 3 over the following days. And here is where the record begins to fail, in the way that records fail when language reaches the limits of what it was designed to carry. The men changed. Not dramatically. Not in ways that announced themselves with the theatrical clarity of Gothic horror. In small, precise, incremental ways that were each individually explicable and collectively constituted something that no individual explanation could account for. A man named Silas Greer stopped being afraid of anything. He described this not as courage, but as the cessation of a machinery he had not previously known was running, as though a noise he had been hearing for 30 years had simply stopped, and the silence was not peaceful, but absolute. And the absence of fear left in him a space that was filled almost immediately by something else, something for which he also had no name. Something that looked outward with eyes that did not blink in the way that human eyes are supposed to blink. Tom Beaumont began to remember things he had not experienced. He described it to Elias with the careful precision of a man who understands he is describing something that should not be possible, and has decided that precision is the only available form of respect. He said the memories were not vague, not dreamlike, not the foggy impressionism of something imagined. They were specific. They had the texture of lived experience, the smell of particular fires, the weight of particular seasons, the specific temperature of specific rivers in specific months of years that were not his years. He said that he was beginning to understand that memory was not a personal possession. He said that the earth remembered everything, and that it was remembering at him, and that he was not sure how much more of it he could receive before the vessel of himself was simply not adequate to the volume. And Elias went into the chamber alone, without telling anyone, on a Friday afternoon when the other miners were at supper. He had been building to this for weeks. He understood it as something that was required of him, not by the chamber, not by the mine, but by his own interior arithmetic. The door that the sound had been opening was nearly open. He understood that what was on the other side of that door was Westing Creek, was the 29 men, was what he had done there and what had been done there, and the difference between those two things, which was perhaps no difference at all, which was perhaps the most unbearable knowledge available to a human being, that there is sometimes no difference between what you do and what is done to you, that agency and passivity collapse into each other under sufficient pressure, and that the man who survives is not the man who acted rightly, is not the man who was simply lucky, but is the man who was made into a particular kind of instrument by a particular kind of situation, and who has been carrying the knowledge of that instrumentality ever since, sealed in the room behind the door, pressing outward. He stood in the chamber in the dark. He had not brought a lamp deliberately, and the sound was everywhere around him and also nowhere, because it had become the base frequency of the air itself, the ground note beneath all other perception. And in the dark, with the walls pressing in and the weight of the mountain above, Elias Cutter finally opened the door. What was on the other side was not a monster. It was not a demon, not a spirit, not any of the supernatural apparatus that the human mind has assembled across centuries to give form to what it cannot face directly. What was on the other side was a Tuesday morning in October of 1863, and 29 men, and the specific sequence of choices and compulsions and terror that had produced an outcome which 11 people could not afterward describe, and which Elias could not afterward hold in his waking mind, because the self that held it would have to be a self large enough to hold it, and he had not, until this chamber, in this mountain, in this valley that the Comanche avoided and the Apache detoured around by 30 miles, he had not until this moment been willing to be that large. He stayed in the chamber for a very long time, hours, possibly, long enough that the darkness became familiar, became almost comfortable. The darkness of the underground, the darkness of the sealed interior place, the darkness that precedes understanding. And in that time the walls did what the walls did, deposited their long memory against his skin, offered him the stratigraphy of all the dying and enduring that had occurred in that particular volume of stone, over a span that made his 29 men seem simultaneously enormous and infinitesimally small. Both things were true. Both things needed to be true. The 29 men were everything. The 29 men were a Tuesday morning in the geological history of a mountain. The self that could hold Elias Cutter had to be large enough to hold both of those truths simultaneously, without resolving the tension between them, without choosing one over the other, without the comfort of a single scale. He came out of the chamber and walked up through the mine to the surface. It was night. The stars over the territory were extraordinary, that particular density of light that is only visible from places far enough from any other light to be genuinely dark, and that people who live in such places sometimes stop seeing, because familiarity is its own form of blindness. Elias saw them. He stood outside the mine entrance and saw them with something approaching the first clear perception he had managed since October of 1863, which is not to say that what he saw was pleasant, or that he was healed in any narrative sense of the word, but that he was present for it, which is a different and perhaps more important thing than being healed. The town of Harrow's Gulch unraveled over the following weeks in ways that were not all attributable to Elias Cutter or to the chamber in the fourth room. The silver vein, when they finally reached it, proved to be less extensive than hoped, a seam rather than a lode, a month's worth of extraction at most. The money dried up. The mine closed. Aldous Pierce left on a Monday morning without entry in his journal, which means the journal was already over, which means something in him had finished its accounting before his body had finished moving through the world. Some of the men stayed through the spring. Most did not. What the chamber had done to those who entered it was not identical in each case, because each person has a different fault line, and the pressure finds each fault line in its own specific way. What it had done, in the most general terms, was to open the gap between what each person knew consciously and what each person knew in the deeper and more inarticulate registers of being, and to force a confrontation between these two versions of knowing. In some cases, this confrontation was survivable. In some cases, it evidently was not. The census takers, returning in the fall, found 23 people where there had been 83. The horizontal line threw the name in the ledger. Elias Cutter left Harrow's Gulch in May of 1874, heading in a direction the accounts do not specify. He told Margaret Cole, who asked him where he was going, that he was going to find the surviving men from Westing Creek. There were 10 of them, not counting himself. He had not spoken to any of them since the war. He said he needed to speak to them now. He did not say what he needed to say, and Margaret Cole did not ask, because there are things that the human voice is not the right instrument for, and what Elias needed to say to those men was one of them. What he needed to say could only be said in the presence of people who already knew it, people who carried the same sealed room inside them, who had been pressing against the same door for the same 11 years. And the saying of it would not be in words, but in the simple act of standing together in the knowledge of what they carried, without the pretense that they did not carry it, without the architectural fiction of the sealed room, without the second self that walked the world in place of the first. The land he rode through on his way out of the territory was the same land it had always been, the red earth and the juniper and the silence that watches. But he rode through it differently. He rode through it at a size that was closer to his actual size, which was large enough to contain what he contained, which was large enough to look at the silence and recognize in it not threat, not the watching of something predatory, but the simple, indifferent witness of a world that was here before he arrived, and would be here when he and all his damage had been absorbed back into the geological patience of everything. The silence watched him go. It watched the way it watches everything, without judgment, without compassion, without cruelty. The land does not care about our psychology. The land does not care about our wars or our guilt or the rooms inside us that we build and seal and then forget the location of. The land is here. It receives what is done upon it. It holds what is left in it. It keeps its own kind of record, which is not written in any language, which does not require readers, which is deposited in the walls of its deep chambers, layer by layer, over spans of time that make our entire human span of suffering seem like a single afternoon in an unimaginable succession of afternoons. But the afternoon matters, even to the mountain, even to the geological patience of the indifferent stone. The afternoon matters, not because the mountain says it does, not because the land affirms it, but because we are the beings for whom the afternoon is everything, for whom a Tuesday morning in October of 1863 is the center of the universe, for whom 29 men are the entirety of the human story. And we will ride through any amount of silence, through any amount of red earth and juniper and open sky, to find the other 10 people who know what we know, to stand with them in the unspeakable knowledge, to allow ourselves to be the size required to contain it. This is what the American West did with its silences, if you went far enough into them. Not the silence of the travel narrative, not the silence of the Manifest Destiny poster. The other silence. The one that had been there longer than the name. The one that waited with geological patience for the cracked vessels to arrive, to fill with what they carried, to overflow or not overflow, to find at last the size required, or to be broken by the failure to find it. There was no guarantee. There was never a guarantee. That is the nature of fracture lines. That is the nature of the door pressed from the inside. The stars above the territory are still extraordinary, on the right night, far enough from any other light. The red earth still holds its record. The silence still watches. And somewhere in the geological memory of a particular valley, in what is now a state with a different name, in the walls of a chamber that was blasted open in the spring of 1874, and then sealed by a rockfall the following autumn, the stratigraphy continues its patient accumulation, layer upon layer, decade upon decade, holding everything, forgetting nothing, waiting in the absolute and extraordinary patience of stone for whoever comes next. Whoever arrives with their cracked vessel, their sealed room, their door being pressed from the inside, to stand in the dark and become, at last, the size required.